Today is Thursday, August the 1st, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here once again with podcast partner and co-host Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are we doing?
We are doing fine. It's a little later than normal for us. It's actually after work hours. In fact, we'll be listening to hear the beeps of people potentially locking the building and locking us in, even though we did put our names up front.
Turning
like
the
beautiful
security
people.
system on.
Yeah, we might have a visit from Mr. Wakefield. He often goes around the building. Even if he sees names there, he'll just want to make sure you're still here. So anyway, hopefully not. Hopefully we'll be uninterrupted. And it's just been a really busy day. We can talk more about that after the break. But we didn't want to not put out a podcast for you guys for this weekend. So I'm doing fine. That was a long comment, Ms. Robinson. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. It really has been quite a week, and today was very busy, and we were faced truly with a dilemma about the podcast, but we decided we couldn't let down our very loyal podcast listeners, and here we are, ready to talk about a very special Olympics.
Oh, man, it really was. So that's what we're talking about today. We are going to address this very special opening ceremony performance. Some of you have seen them. Count yourself blessed if you didn't see them for the 2024 Summer Olympics. And we're going to consider what our Bible and prophecy-informed brains might think about something like that. So here we go. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Boyer. We appreciate your music, and welcome again to the Living Youth Podcast. And I should explain, actually, it's a Thursday, as you heard Mr. Robinson say here at the very beginning. So we're here a little bit late because I'm going to be out of town tomorrow. I'm going to pick up my, several members of my family and some others who have been serving at the West Virginia preteen camp. So I'm taking a vacation day tomorrow to head out and pick them up and try to help their reintroduction into regular society be as easy as possible. So we really did need to record this today. And yet at the same time, wow, we've got a magazine we've been getting done, finished a draft for a booklet. It's been quite a week. But at the same time, we didn't want to, we're going to every once in a while. We do sometimes, we miss a podcast. We're trying to think about how we can maybe reuse old podcasts occasionally, classics. If you've got an old one out there you like, if you think that you'd like, make sure others heard it, let us know. But especially with this topic, because it would just be old a week from now. In fact, none of us want to think about this much longer, but we just felt we had to talk about the Olympics, not the Olympics themselves. In fact, actually, we were just talking earlier about this particular boxer, right? Who they don't even know exactly what sex the boxer is, but it's boxing women. And
To be determined.
This Italian woman quit after 40-something seconds after being pounded just with this person's fist once or twice and feared for her life. So a lot of things that we could discuss, but what will get old, at least we want it to get old, because none of us wants these images in our minds for long, are the opening ceremonies for the Olympics. Not every detail, but the details that some of you probably saw and thought, oh yeah, I bet Mr. Smith and Ms. Robbins are going to talk about those. So we're going to talk about the opening ceremony. And we thought it best because some of you haven't seen it. And we're not telling you to go online and look at it. It's just an abomination and something. So rather, Mr. Josh Lyons has worked on a commentary about the opening ceremonies and these particular events. And he grabbed an item from the AP News that was published on July 29th. So I thought just reading from the AP News, this is actually, they're not even necessarily anti what happened. If you read the title of the AP News article, it says the Paris Olympics opening was wacky and wonderful and upset bishops. Here's why. So I'm just grabbing a paragraph out of that. And they summarize by saying Paris didn't just push the envelope. It did away with it entirely as it hammered home a message that freedom must know no bounds. A practically naked singer, painted blue, made thinly veiled references to his body parts. Blonde, bearded drag queen, and I don't know how this individual says,
Right.
Piche, crawled on all fours to the thumping beat of, quote, Freed from Desire by singer-songwriter Gala perhaps, who has long been a potent voice against homophobia. There were the beginnings of and I am not going to say the term that the AP published here because we are a family podcast, that just had some of these performers beginning to do something. But then it says, however, the door was slammed on the camera before things got really steamy. So regrettably, it was
Wow.
something unpleasant. And the tail end of an intimate embrace between two men who danced away, hugging and holding hands. That's a short summary, but also let's just say there were many drag queens showcased. It also featured a depiction in these windows of Marie Antoinette singing out of her severed head that was being held in her arms with her bloody neck there above her body. Had Celine Dion and Lady Gaga featured, who that might be more subtle, but at the same time, apparently both of them are really touted as queer icons. Not that they themselves are, but they're often considered that. And there was also a reenactment, and there's been some controversy here, but actually there's not that much room for controversy in terms of what it was. There was a reenactment of what appeared to be the famous Last Supper painting by Leonardo da Vinci, depicting Jesus with his disciples on his final Passover. Now, many of you are familiar with this old painting. It's like a long table from left to right. You got a depiction of hippie Jesus, regrettably, not actual Jesus, but still long-haired Jesus in the middle with 6 disciples on each side. It's famously called the Last Supper. And of course, who was present for this Last Supper? Well, a bunch of drag queens and sexual deviants. And the woman in the middle herself is actually a lesbian activist. Now, the official Olympics Twitter account claimed at first that this was not a depiction of the Last Supper. This was a depiction of a Greek divine feast, which to a certain extent has some credibility because the blue naked Smurf demon that they had presented as a meal on a plate essentially was, that seemed the vibe. He was like a Dionysus, like the Greek god of hedonism and insanity and wine and partying. But at the same time, the woman who was featured in the middle as in the Jesus spot in the painting, online, she herself, I thought she tweeted it, but I think she's more on Instagram. On Instagram, she talked about being Olympic Jesus, quote unquote. The creator, Thomas Joly, I'm not sure how he says his name, he defended all of this as a depiction of the Last Supper. He highlighted, frankly, other ways in which the Last Supper has been parodied, if you will, or if not parodied, used by, I think, Nintendo. There's an example actually by Star Wars. They had a Star Wars depiction with Luke in the middle. And by the way, we don't actually do paintings of Jesus, just so you know. In this case, it's the thought that counts, and we'll get to that. But at the same time, yeah, they recognize, well, why should you be offended? They're just trying to be inclusive. However, how bad was? Oh, and finally, the thing I want to mention is that while there was a lot of like a rave party, there was a lot of drag queens dancing, etc. And who was mixed in with the drag queens? A bunch of kids as well. They had little kids there amongst the drag queens. How bad was it? The organization, an organization of homosexuals called Gays Against Groomers, they themselves recognize how bad things have gotten, that even as homosexuals, they feel they're being given a bad name by all this stuff. Even they came out publicly against it and said it was absolutely,
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, said it was absolutely terrible.
Well, first of all, I didn't know there was Gays Against Groomers.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how I feel about that. We're moving in the right direction.
I think they're happy that the needle finally moved in their favor.
Yeah.
Their embrace. They realize, oh wait, it's kept on going. We don't want that.
Yeah,
right?
no, you're right. There does seem to be a genuine undercurrent of people that were happy being the way they are, and too much attention has been brought to them, and now it's just made things worse. It's gone too far. Like that. What does that tell
For them,
you?
it's gone too. Yeah, we would say it went too far a long time ago, but for them, even they say this has gone too far. Yep. Okay, so we're gonna jump right into it, and we have just a few bullet points we just want to talk, because that's our theme here. You young people, your teens and young adults and families sitting around. We don't want to just experience something and begin reacting immediately like the world. We want, or haven't necessarily like the world at all. Sometimes our reactions may overlap with the world. Sometimes they're going to differ. We just want to make sure our reactions are governed by biblical thinking, by, in this case, also a little bit of prophetic thinking, but really Christ thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
God was up in heaven. Jesus Christ was up in heaven. They had the chance to look down, and I'm not saying they would say it this way, but what's going on earth these days?
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's what they saw, and we want to be able to think their thoughts after them. So we want to be able to be informed biblically. And the first point I just want to make really plain. Make no mistake, this was a celebration of sexual perversion. There's no other way to be honest and to characterize all this. They would say, and they have said, no, this was about acceptance. We're trying to talk about how we should, accept one another and love one another. Notice they always depict these things in the context of sexual perversion. Why is it I have to accept these lifestyles for me to be declared a loving and accepting person? Why couldn't it have been a celebration of other people that are stigmatized, whether it's the handicap, for instance, deal with a very challenging society? It's not that. It is, when they say accept, what they mean is we're celebrating how you should accept all of this perversion. That is exactly what they mean by this. The transsexual agenda, homosexuality, the crisscrossing, the gender barriers. That's 100% what this was.
Well, that reminds me of one of these quotes I've collected here, and it's from the inter-LGBT president James Lepelier, and he said, well, we assume it's a he.
You never know these days. That's right.
If you saw the opening ceremony last night, you'd think it was like that normally, but it's not. France tried to show what it should be and not what it is. So even there, the idea is we haven't gone far enough.
Oh yeah. In fact, that's a great quote. That's going to make me jump ahead to my next point. I'm going to jump to a different point. These aren't ordered. What I have here.
I feel like my role here in this podcast is to bring up something that's out of order and make you jump to a new point.
Not at all. Hey, I appreciate the research you've done in this regard because I don't really have a particular order here, and that's one of the things I wanted to highlight. So not only was it a celebration of sexual perversion, but a second point. This is what leaders in France chose. They consciously chose to use this to show the world and to represent themselves.
Yep.
Now, the interesting thing is, on one hand, you've got people who found this abhorrent. In fact, another point I wanted to make is don't assume that ordinary French citizens thought this was great. I've seen at least one clip of citizens, I think they were in Paris watching in their home, and you could tell they were like, what in the world? What is this?
I think that's a very good point to make because I've heard more than one person say, oh yeah, France really showed us who they are, the French. And I thought, no, that's not accurate at all. Just go to San Francisco or some other hot spots in the United States, you would have seen the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now, what I will say is, and this is actually another element of biblical thinking that is very unique to the church in that regard. And that is that, Reuben, okay, we know the tribes of Israel. Some of them might be fuzzier, but some of them were very plain on. And when it comes to one of the 10 northern tribes, Reuben is one of the 10 northern tribes who we are very certain is associated with France. It just seems like that's the best fit and try. We know Reuben exists somewhere in the world as a people. And based on the best evidence we have, that does seem to be France. And it is interesting, of all the brothers, Reuben actually should have been a firstborn, right? Wasn't he the firstborn?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. But he lost that because he slept with his father's concubine.
Yep.
And it is interesting how France is associated with sexual issues, whether it's we won't go into too far, but regardless, it's fascinating in that regard. And yet you do have this sort of this sexual inappropriateness that got Reuben in trouble in the past. And it is interesting to see such things in this culture. But at the same time, we should not project that on all of the people of France. But at the same time, for the leaders, it's important to recognize they chose this. And even though it astonishes some that they chose it, it also, just like Mr. Robinson said, it disappoints others because they feel, oh, this is France saying what it should be, what it wants to be, but we're just not there yet. If only it were as open as we depicted in the in this presentation. So this is also the leaders declaring this is what we want to be, right? We're not there yet, but this is the way the whole world should be.
Got another quote then for you.
Oh, great. Let's have
so
it.
one of the a drag queen was one of the people that carried the Olympic flame. So if you're a younger listener and you're really not that familiar with the Olympics, they're supposed to carry this eternal flame from Olympics to Olympics, and people carry him from wherever the last Olympics was to the new one, or maybe it goes
Yeah.
to Greece in between. I don't know.
Yeah, and we're not even going to talk about potential, any heathen elements like
Right.
that beyond the Olympics. Please help us, allow us to focus on the sexual inappropriateness. But anyway, go.
So anyway, one of the people that carried it was a drag queen, and they commented on this whole thing. So here's just a little collection of comments from this drag queen.
Now, is this the drag queen who carried the torch, or someone commenting?
Carried
The
the
actual one who
torch.
got to carry the torch part of the way. Okay.
Should I use the name?
Just say the person. Yeah.
Okay. Nikki Doll.
Okay.
Maybe if you're in this community, that's a familiar name. I don't know. Okay. The opening ceremony did ruffle some feathers, and I love it. I'm just going to scoot down to some more. On Sunday, Doll called it an honor to perform at the opening ceremony. It was my absolute honor to perform it in front of billions of people around the world and celebrate our Olympians. Oh, I shouldn't have skipped the earlier one because she brags about how the Olympics are the biggest stage in the world and you get to see queer people performing. But here's the quote that what you just said reminded me of. Nikki Doll goes on to say, and remember, to the ones that had their feathers ruffled seeing queerness on their screen, all caps, we ain't going nowhere.
Yeah.
And so, and that, I mean, that is the plan. It's not gone far enough. We're not going anywhere. We're going to throw this in your face as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen it, and I'm not entirely sure what all they had in mind. But I've seen, for instance, Le Monde, the magazine, title an article about all these opening ceremonies. Paris 2024 Olympics, the rule-breaking opening ceremony in pictures. Now, I want to give them some credit. They might have actually focused on, say, other things that were non-traditional about the way they did, like they had the athletes come over in boats. They had the Olympic cauldron or whatever they call it, where the fire is like in a balloon, hot air balloon instead of such. But yeah, I would say that indeed, even forget tradition, even just morally, they're doing that. And here you have these others celebrating. Yes, this was us on the biggest world stage where all the countries of the world are trying to get together and do the right thing for once. In fact, I saw a moving image today from table tennis. I guess we'd call it ping pong, but table tennis, where you had, I think China had the gold, North Korea got the silver, and South Korea got the bronze.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, but then the South Korean delegate or athlete wanted to take a selfie with all of them, and so you had these North Koreans and South Koreans kind of grouped together in a selfie, and it was kind of moving just to see the picture. Right here you have these people that can't. They're literally brothers, really, in terms of their peoples, and they can't spend time together because of this regime and because of these political divides. And so it is moving, little moments like that. But so, yeah, it's a big stage that's supposed to picture the best of humanity coming together in terms of what we can do. But here it says, and so therefore, what are we showing? Yep, we're not going anywhere. Yep. This is a permanent feature of your world now.
So it was a real celebration of things that if you've even cracked the Bible once, are roundly criticized. Mr. Smith, you had a great scripture that I thought we could fit in right here about the display, the performance, and the pride that was taken in this bit of quote unquote entertainment.
I do have some. Let's see. I would look at Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 9. And now we'll come back to another one here in a minute. But Isaiah 3 and verse 9, where it says, the look on their countenance witnesses against them. Think of countenance as a face, their look on their face. The look on their face witnesses against them. And they declare their sin as Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to their soul, for they have brought evil upon themselves. I think in so many ways this verse fits. One, it says, look on their countenance. The look on their countenance is witness against them. They're doing something shameful. They're depicting a sinful approach to life. And yet, look at them, they're celebrating it. I mean, the look in their face is joyous. They are happy. This is fantastic that we're getting to depict this as something that the entire world should embrace. They declare their sin as Sodom. You know, when you read the account of Sodom, the people there weren't ashamed of what they were there for. They were fine about it. This wasn't something done in a back alley. This was a way of life there, just declaring
They're
to Lot, hey, bring out those guys, right?
I mean, it's possible that they didn't really have any recognition that's not a great way of life.
Exactly. It might have been so normal for them that that's just what happened. And then what also caught my attention was this talk about how here you have the kind of decision makers, the shapers of things who are making these decisions that not every French person would go along with. Not every Parisian was delighted by that. And it reminds me of the quality of our leadership now. And we see that in Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 12, just a few verses down, where it says here, as for my people, God says, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. Oh, my people, those who lead you cause you to err, that is, to make error, and destroy the way of your paths. Now, don't get too caught up in children and women, though that is still really relevant. It is not without cause that you see, frankly, a lot of women driving some of the woke ideology. I know when I first saw when I was first introduced to the concept of Drag Queen Story Hour, and there was a video on straight up news like CBS, like a regular news station that was covering the story. It was filled with parents and children to listen to this grotesquely dressed drag queen read a story to all the children and even ask all of them, who here wants to be a drag queen? And the kids are raising their
That's
hand.
crazy.
Oh, it's absolutely crazy. And at least in my memory, if I recall, I could be wrong, the parents in that room were dominated by mothers. It was mothers with their children. Now, of course, in a lot of cases, it could be because the dad is at work. That's possible. It also could be because the dad would want to jump into a river, and swim away before, he allowed something like that. But also could be because a lot of dads have just abdicated their leadership role, to their wives.
Because they become drag queens, apparently.
It's possible. So if you really look into this, you do see a lot of females driving some of it. Not all of them, regrettably. Then you have a lot of men that want a virtue signal that, hey, I'm with it. I'm with the program. And so they just kind of fall in line instead of leading in a different direction.
It's kind of ironic how here at the end of the age, there's this kind of gender dysphoria, and some are asking us to actually fully accept a lie that a man can become a woman and vice versa, and that gender is a social construct and everything. You know who believes in gender? Satan, the devil. He really is very effective at taking our natural gender tendencies and using them against us. And I feel like really this woke ideology and those behind it pressing it, they really take advantage of what ought to be a laudable trait with women, which is their compassion and their empathy and sympathy. It's just misplaced and misguided and doing a lot of damage by supporting this kind of lifestyle because, I mean, we're kind of getting off on I'm getting us off into another podcast here, but like, it's a pretty grim story if you find out how these people's lives turned out when they follow one of these destructive lifestyles.
Yeah. You make such a good point that the devil, he is an expert in like a hacker, if you will. It's not in this case that he is overriding a lot of systems. It's that he's using them, that compassion in fact, we do have an older podcast on weaponizing love. If you go to livingyouth.org and you go to the menu and click on podcast, or right now, actually, if you just look on the pinned post at the top, you can see a link to that same page for our podcast and scroll down the list and you'll see one about weaponizing love. Someone asked us to do something on that topic recently. And I remember we had that one, but it might be good to revisit it sometime where the concept of love or acceptance, as they talk about in these opening ceremony presentations, where that is being weaponized against you, because who wants to be unloving? I don't want to be unloving, Mr. Robinson. Who wants to be unaccepting in terms of intolerant of others? Who wants to be a bigot and all these other things? Well, none of us do. And so they try to tell you, okay, well, to be loving, accepting, and to be tolerant and to not be a bigot, then you have to accept all of these things. And that has never been the Christian way of life. If we see God says something is bad and wrong, we have to call that out and help such people overcome those things, not celebrate that lifestyle and encourage more to enter it. And so I know I count on my wife and her sense of compassion to help regulate me sometimes, to help bring something to my attention when I should care about it more, or when I should take a more sympathetic stand, versus the feedback I provide, where sometimes I hope I help her back off of something sometimes. Like, yeah, we can care about that, but at the same time, sometimes we got to let something go. Here, I would say that you've put it so well that it's like as if the devil is taking advantage of the beautiful design
Hmm.
of that's more inherent in women, and has actually weaponized it in a certain way
Yeah.
to make them leaders of such things.
Seeing a spectacle like this, because something you said reminded me of how this was proudly presented on a stage to the whole world.
By choice.
There's only a handful of, there's like maybe the Super Bowl and the World Cup and things like that, but the Olympics, pretty big deal. And I'm just reminded again of how we got there, because the words like acceptance and tolerance are thrown out there. And so you might quibble with the words I'd use, but tell me if you felt like I felt like the '90s really was the decade that began truly the strong push to accept alternate lifestyles.
Could be.
And the push was, look, just be tolerant. Like, don't persecute us. You don't have to agree with us, but just don't persecute us. And it feels like the collective we as a culture were like, all right, because like you said, nobody wants to be accused of being bigoted and hateful and all those kinds of things. All right, fine. But then from 2000 2010, that decade, it switched from tolerance to acceptance. It's like, not just tolerating us is not enough. You kind of have to accept the lifestyle. And if you don't accept the lifestyle, then you're even more of a bigot. And then from 2010 to 2020, and I'm rounding these off and very rough, it went beyond acceptance. It was, if you didn't agree with you're again, I've referenced this so many times, but the idea in your article of New Gods, New Sins, well, in our modern Western culture, the new sin became not accepting alternate lifestyles. If you didn't accept it, like, you were the one that was wrong and hateful and bigoted, and we're the right people. We're in the right here because we're diverse and loving and all those kinds of things. Which gets us to the last. I mean, it really feels like 2020 was a true ramping up of pushing like an unfiltered version of this onto the culture. And man, we saw it pay off. And I mean that in a very ironic way, in spades at this Olympic event. How you have to ask yourself, this is what we grew up with. This is not normal. How did we get to the point where that a whole group of Olympic organizers thought this was a great idea? And yes, they felt the heat. There was some real pushback on it, but it's not like they've really disowned it or said maybe that wasn't a good idea. They just defended themselves. They said things like, here's another quote from the event organizer. Clearly, there was never an intention to show disrespect to any religious group. The opening ceremony tried to celebrate community tolerance. And then, there's those words again that have just been weaponized and used against us. So I just didn't want to let this topic pass without pointing out, I did a sermon, which, by the way, if I ever had a sermon that I would say was a bad sermon, it's this one. I tried it twice. It didn't work either time.
True confessions on the podcast.
The idea I still stand behind, but it never worked. But I was trying to put together a sermon that put together very, very, very clear things that were, the question I was trying to answer in, when does God actively intervene in a culture or a society or the world? And one of them is actually this kind of thing. There's references back to Sodom and Gomorrah quite often as a real tipping point. I think God intervened there very directly. And then you look at the Israel when it was its own nation, Judah when it was its own nation, and God indicted them for being worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. And so if you want to know when you're really at a tipping point in civilization, it's when this kind of thing is not only happening widespread, but it's like out in the open, and there's a pride behind it.
Yeah. You said something that reminded me of this article that I haven't read yet, but I had saved it, and it seems so fitting now that I have now that we're here. And it's a New York Times article, and it's very recent. Let me see if I can see the date on that. Well, the email from the New York Times to me just came yesterday, so I'm not sure actually when it was published, but it's still pretty fresh. And it's by Charles M. Blow. He is I've seen him frequently in the New York Times, and the title is this: People say queer people are born that way. It's more complicated. That is, it's more complicated than that. Well, before I hit what he says, because it impacts very much everything Mr. Robinson's talking about acceptance and this and that, you have to understand how you're being manipulated and how you and the world were brought to this point where now the new measure of acceptance is accepting not even just necessarily homosexuals, but everything you saw there, which was just the sexualization of clothing, having these people hang around children, the idea that we can throw them in this religious scene that will offend all of these individuals.
And then claim that's not what we were
Yeah,
trying
exactly.
to do.
So in this article, he highlights, and let me give you some background. Many of you younger listeners, our teens and young adults, grew up to a certain extent being told that homosexuality was innate, it was something inherent, that therapies to try to help someone overcome such things were inherently wrong because that's like trying to help a duck not be a duck or help someone who's heterosexual not be hetero. This is innate. This is who these people are. And how can you criminalize someone who just is the way they are, right? How can you make that they can't be any other way? So this idea that we could be born that way was a very big deal, and it was a powerful tool. And it wasn't meant to ignore the possibility. Sorry, before that, it was understood that we are complicated beings who have many influences, and some of those are genetic, some of them are not genetic. There's stronger evidence, just so you know, of a genetic tie between violence and DNA or alcoholism and DNA. That doesn't mean we embrace violence and alcoholism. Rather, we recognize, okay, that's a special burden that a person might have. We need to make sure we help them overcome that. So even if that were the case, that people are born with particular burdens, it doesn't mean we embrace a lifestyle. It means that we help that person through that burden. Well, that said, there's a bit of a history here, and it ties into the Olympics too. And I think this is why Lady Gaga, for instance, is a queer icon because of this particular song. And he starts his article by saying, when Lady Gaga released Born This Way, the 2011 song on an album of the same name, it was an instant hit and an instant LGBTQ anthem. The song debuted at #1 on the Billboard Top 100, and Elton John called it, quote, the new gay anthem. So that song itself was very influential. It had an impact. It swayed people over. Look, I'm born this way. I'm not going to apologize, right? I'm born this way. Well, he goes on and says, Born This Way as a slogan was a tremendous cultural and political success. They recognized this opened doors, this concept that had not been opened before. But he continues, the problem is that it isn't supported by the science. The emerging scientific consensus is that sexual orientation isn't purely genetic. A person's genetic makeup and exposure to prenatal hormones may provide a propensity to queerness, but they aren't determinative. Other factors also likely play a role. In other words, it's like anything else. We are exposed to things in the womb that can shape us potentially, but the idea that that's all we are, that's just nonsense, and that's not the way life is. So he says, Born This Way may unfortunately have been an oversimplification. However, that didn't change the fact that it was still very powerful and it was really used. And so he says, as both a scientific concept and a political ideology, it was easy to understand, accept, and digest. And so they ignored the subtleties and just pushed it forward. And now it's interesting. They're now finally starting to say, maybe we can finally admit the truth and give it up. Because now people are no longer saying, hey, we shouldn't put people through therapy to help them overcome homosexual urges because they're born that way. And now we don't got to say that anymore, because now people just recognize that it's hurtful. And hey, who wants to say something hurtful? Mm-hmm. They've recognized they've moved the goalposts so far about human behavior, they don't even have to embrace it, but they do recognize it was a lie from the beginning. So that's what they've done. They've sold us like you're holding against this person something that they were literally. Some have even said God created me this way. No, man's world may have abused you, may have given you a misshapen path, may have thrown people in your way that have not caused you, but have definitely influenced you in a strong way to accept things you should never have accepted. But absolutely not. Your God didn't create you
Right.
that way.
Yeah. No, there are a lot of factors that play into pushing somebody into one of those lifestyles. And I mean, I don't know if you want me to go into history again, but, the Greeks, the Romans, the more, the Spartans, I mean, that's just was the culture.
Right.
You groomed a young boy.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of how it was. I remember the 90s. So again, to me, the 90s wasn't the beginning of the push to normalize homosexuality. It's just when it kind of really got some
Some real traction.
some real traction. Good, thank you.
Yeah, I would say that.
Because
I would say
I mean, the 70s and the 80s in some segments, say like San Francisco, for example, had pockets of that was accepted behavior.
Right.
But on a national scene, well, like you mentioned in our last podcast, I think the marketing of evil.
Mm-hmm.
They talked about how in the 80s, the push to normalize homosexuality in particular had not gone well. And so they concocted a plan on what is it that we need to do so that we can get this
Right.
successfully accepted. And that presented us with the 90s. Okay. But I remember, because I listened to a whole lot of talk radio back then, there was a push to get people to believe that there was the so-called gay gene. And I stayed on top of that and knew that they have not found a gay gene. But I couldn't believe how many people had believed, oh, no, it's genetic. There's a gay gene. But it never was. But then, Mr. Smith, and I know this was embedded in your earlier comments, the irony of born this way, when if you could want to change genders, you weren't born that way. That's right. Apparently.
That's right.
So even with within this whole ideology, there's a whole, just a clear black and white lie, within this whole idea. So it's just crazy.
Oh, it really is. So we didn't want to get too far afield, but it is helpful to understand where all of this has come from and how we got to a point where they can be pushing things like this. There's two other items we wanted to mention on this topic. One was about the Last Supper, quote unquote. I do want to highlight, if you're familiar with the Last Supper, we don't paint pictures of Jesus. We don't do that. The second commandment talks about not depicting God, and we believe Jesus is God. So we don't want to be praying and have stuck in our minds this image of some hippie, that we're always thinking of. However, that doesn't make the attempt to, I want to say mock it. They probably didn't think they were mocking it, but to use it as fodder for your agenda of sexual perversion, that doesn't make it less offensive, because to a certain extent, it's the thought that counts.
Yes.
And in this case, they consciously were taking something that they know is cherished by many people who claim Christianity, that they wanted to use for their own purposes. And God does take notice of such things. It's almost like we talk about how God appreciates steps toward righteousness, even like I've mentioned more than once, I think my example of trying to keep the days of unleavened bread the first time, and I did it with bagels and saltines, which are both very leavened for those who don't know. But I was ignorant. I was stupid.
You ate them at the same time?
No, that would be funny. No, I had my mom buy bagels. I was a teenager and I didn't have a car or money at the time. Had my mother buy bagels. She didn't know why. I didn't explain to her. And I thought they were chewy. And so that must be why they're unleavened. That must what make bagels so chewy. And then saltines, I just knew they were flat, so I figured that was it. So that's what I was taking to school for lunch.
There's actually some logic embedded in that.
Exactly.
I like that.
It's weird logic, I know. I just knew unleavened bread was going to be a weird kind of bread, and I knew bagels were kind of dense, right? Okay, so I spent my first attempt at keeping the days of unleavened bread in ignorance, but sincerity, trying to do the right thing, but doing it very poorly. And I like to think, and I pray that I'm able to be there and hear his voice after the resurrection, to ask, for my Father to tell me, yeah, I was, oh, that's hilarious. You were trying, you're just kind of dumb, and I appreciate it. Well, here's the thing. I would paint that as kind of if you'll just forgive the fuzziness, an imperfect desire to obey, right? It's not fully informed, but it's trying. Then think of it this way. Yeah, they're taking a painting that depicts a hippie Jesus that we wouldn't really even care about, because you recognize that's not Jesus. There's nothing about that's actually realistic. But that said, it's the thought that counts. It was like an imperfect attempt to blaspheme, if you will. It was an imperfect attempt to drag God down from heaven and press him into your desire of selling your bill of your collection of goods to the world. So yeah, we may not be into the Last Supper, but we can still take offense at something like that, because it's just not. It's absolutely a stench in God's nose.
I know this is not what we're podcasting about, but I there are several examples in the Bible where God, with people that didn't know better, accepted imperfect worship.
Yes.
Like is it King Hezekiah that led the Great Restoration, and they're trying to get ready to keep the spring holy days?
Oh,
and
Passover,
it's Hezekiah, right? Yeah.
Yeah, people who were not clean,
right,
trying to do the Passover, right?
Yep. And they weren't going to be ready in time, and they just asked God, "Hey, will this be?" The king did. The king was a very formal prayer, and God said yes. Now, that does not mean a new pattern was created.
Right.
Suddenly, this was okay. No, it's just in their ignorance and their attempt to do the right thing, God was like, "I got you." If God talks like that, and but he accepted it. But by next year
they should know
better.
They
should know better, and they wouldn't do it. Okay, you know what? I'm glad you just said what you said. By the way, coming back to the topic, because I was going to actually ask you that question, which you basically answered, which was, you're a young listener out there. Okay, you've seen what's happened. You've seen there's this. Okay, here's what you know. There's clearly some real weirdos who've done a recreation of this Leonardo da Vinci painting, The Last Supper, iconic painting, and they clearly did it in a kind of a mocking way, and then they mixed Greek and Roman mythology in it with Dionysus and all this other thing. And so if I was a young teen listening, I would wonder, well, how should I feel about this? I mean, they're mocking Christianity, but we understand that's not true. That's not Christ. Christ doesn't look like that,
Right.
This is not at all an accurate painting. Then it also made me think of the Da Vinci Code. It's amazing how much this painting has factored in the culture. How should a teen, you basically answered this, but if you put a finer point on it, how should a teen listening to this podcast think, oh, well, how should I think? I mean, they're mocking something we know is not true, but yet at the same time, the intent seems to be, they may have missed the mark in terms of true Christianity,
right?
But it's only because they didn't know better.
If they knew better, they could in a sense do quote unquote better. Great way to frame that question, Mr. Robinson. I would personally think of it this way: that we are blessed with enough knowledge to be balanced about it. If we truly did believe like this was a depiction of Jesus Christ and this were his, then definitely would be offended, but we could even be overcome by that offense, by a spirit of offense. Like, how dare these people, they're just really, I mean, yes, it is a stench. It should be. But at the same time, we can also step back and realize this is almost like, part of the world offending attacking part of the world. Another way, let me make a hypothetical that might be in the the area what you're talking about. Let's say someone wanted to, because I've seen cases where people talk about they know the Bible says that if you blaspheme the Holy Spirit, you can't be saved.
Right.
Well, we understand that in the church. If you're not familiar with that, we have a great whiteboard on the unpardonable sin. You can take a look. A lot of people worry about it that don't need to worry about it. Just feel free and look at that whiteboard. But there's used to be YouTube videos of atheists who are trying to actively blaspheme the Holy Spirit to show how much they don't believe in the Bible. And it's interesting because they don't even know how to properly blaspheme the Holy Spirit. They think of it as a person. They don't fully understand. And so I think that those were, on one hand, kind of amusing, but on the other hand, not really, because it is the thought that counts. The fact is they're just stewing in their anti-God ignorance. Or what if someone wanted to offend you personally and they knew you were a Christian? It's like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this really ugly, nasty, sinful thing on Sunday because that's Christian's special day. And I'm going to send him this ugly, terrible email or post on Facebook, whatever it is. Well, on one hand, we don't have to just knee-jerk reaction like everybody else. It's kind of nice. It's Sunday. It's not even, it's like, it's actually, it's not the Lord's day in that sense. On the other hand, it is the thought that counts, and God still does take notice of that. So I think that knowing that you have people that the only reason they're not more offensive is because they're too ignorant to be more offensive, it does give us some breathing space in which we can find some balance.
Yeah.
But it does not change the fact that we should recognize it for what it is. It is still an anti-God attitude, even if they don't know enough about God to attempt to insult him properly.
That reminds me of Mr. Armstrong said in The Mystery of the Ages, I think in multiple places, that most of humanity was passively hostile to God. They didn't follow his ways and his laws and things, but a lot of it was because some level of a mix of ignorance and just we want to do our own thing. But it really feels like this kind of display right here is a much more active rebellion against God. The God is in their crosshairs, so to speak, and they do want to be in full rebellion against God. They reject even their own what they were created to be. Think of Romans 1. I won't even try to quote it on the fly, but just rejecting gender, rejecting everything that's just reality and what God has created, and the rebellion is active. Okay, so let me ask you a question then. I think we're coming full circle here. So there's been this public spectacle and display, and some people defend them, and some people recognize this was all kind of crazy. Is there any notable group out there that's pushing back on this?
Mr. Robinson, he is really gaining the skills to move us forward in these podcasts as we get into the mire. Doing a good job, Mr. Robinson. You're good. Okay. And this relates to a sermon I just gave this Sabbath here in Charlotte, which is which I had to credit Mr. Robinson for his idea in terms of the idea that of the four horsemen to come in the future, it's the white horse that comes first. It is this galloping counterfeit Christianity come to conquer the world. Yeah, if you were in France and you want to push back and stuff like this, well, how can you from a really secular culture? In fact, there were some that would express their offense only in that Christianity, quote unquote, is always the punching bag. Why not do a skit mocking Islam? Why not do a skit mocking Muhammad?
Because they'll blow up your house.
That's exactly right. So it's the one religion that allows itself to be a punching bag. And so some would take offense, feel like, no, we should be equally insulting to everybody. Yeah. But if it feels like the culture is off the rails and you're a French citizen, what do you harken back to? Well, you could hark back to, classic values we all used to hold. But the thing is, those had to come from somewhere. And we'll often say that they're biblical values. And definitely the organization that pressed the values definitely used the Bible here and there. Even societies that don't understand why marriage should be a man and a woman, that's still a biblical value, even if they've never seen a Bible in their life, right? That is the way God designed the family. But the fact is, especially France actually has a deep history in relation to this faith. Really, what the best weapon they have is the Catholic Church.
You made a good point. I'm sorry to interrupt your thought,
ahead,
but I think especially for the bulk of our audience is still going to be Americans. Although we found that we have a lot not from the U.S.
A lot of countries. It's amazing where you guys are from.
Ian, I'm pretty sure you made this point in your sermon this last Sabbath. When you say, if you're European, when you're in Europe and you say Christian, they mean Catholic, right? Like if you're a French person and you feel like Christianity has been mocked and somebody should do something about it, to you, that's the Catholics, because that's who Christianity is. In America, we don't tend to think that way.
Yes.
Christianity is more Protestant here and not Catholic, but around the rest of the world, Christian, in the minds of many, Christian equals Catholic. And I thought that was such a good point to make.
Oh, well, thanks. It is interesting to me because, of course, growing up in America, I don't tend to think that way, and yet that is far more the norm. In fact, I remember my boss when I was an actuary, wonderful lady, and I haven't mentioned her on the podcast before, but she was from Quebec, and she, in terms of going back and visiting her family, her family was generally, we would consider them, pretty secular. My understanding was, and I could be wrong about this. I don't know if she'd ever listen to the podcast, but I think her family wasn't necessarily church going because it's fairly secular. They all felt very secular. However, if they had any religious ties at all, it was Catholic. And when it came to being in America, at least this was her experience, if I recall, if I'm representing her accurately, because she married a fellow here in America who was a Christian but not Catholic. And if I recall, she told me that from her family's perspective, while they themselves were not practicing Catholics, Christianity was Catholicism. And if you were anything else, then it's a cult. It's either the Catholic Church or it's a cult. And they really didn't have any room for anything in between.
Yeah.
So if you're really, what is the pillar religion or faith of Western civilization? It is the Catholic Church.
Yep.
And the popes understand that. Pope John Paul II used to very explicitly try to encourage Europe to go back to its roots. And by its roots, it meant its Catholic roots. When you think of Christendom, that old classic word, the influence of Christianity in the world, Christendom, as if it were a nation, you tend to think of Europe as Christendom. What was the empire that's going to be revived? What was it called? The Holy Roman Empire. And what was that? That was essentially massively Europe. So I think it is interesting because not everybody was excited about this. Even in France, it's like, what are we doing? Well, when the pushback starts, you start to recognize, and this isn't just this is also against, and this would be too far afield, but we'll mention here at the end, there's other cultural forces where people are going to be tempted to want to push back on. When you have massive immigration from cultures that are very non-Western, and they're bringing their faith, they're bringing their religion. In fact, some of their faiths are causing deaths, in terms of extremists. You want to fight fire with fire. And a lot of the stuff, what you saw in the Olympic ceremony, it might seem secular. It is not secular. It is like a different religion. It is an ideology that holds to certain doctrines, that has certain dogmas. And there is a desire for people to push back. And when you push back, you want to fight fire with fire. So again, trying to think not just biblically, but prophetically as well, just speculating. Some of this could feed into that reaction in Europe, even some of what we're seeing in boxing, like we mentioned at the beginning. How do we push back on this? Well, you know what? There is a ready-made package of faith and beliefs and doctrines and concepts that, guess what, goes back literally hundreds of years on the continent. And some of the stuff really could feed back this kind of pushback from strong Roman Catholicism.
Yep. We know what Satan's master plan is in parts, and one of the things is to have the Roman Catholic Church lead a at least, I don't know, I'm reluctant to say worldwide, although that certainly is, there certainly is some inference to that in Revelation when it's described, but like a giant world ruling church that expects complete conformity. And so what a great way, whether intentional or not, to get people to move in that direction is, we see all the stuff going on, and we just wish somebody won't somebody do something about this? And and here comes the Catholic Church and throws their cloak off their head, and I'm here, we'll save you. And who doesn't want that? Well, there's a lot of people who want that. They want somebody to do something about it.
Well, deep down, profoundly, we want a worldview. We want to know, how does the world work? What is right? What is wrong? How does the world work? And if you've bought into modernity, this kind of modern world that surrounds us, this is what's being sold to you as a bunch of morals and right and wrong. And increasingly people are looking at it saying, no way, this, what have I done? It doesn't lead this way. And then there's this gaping vacuum in you. Well, then what is right and wrong? What is right in the world? And guess what? There is an entire highly developed 2,000-year-old almost institution that is ready to fill that vacuum. So I think that could be part of the pushback. Maybe we could wrap up here. We're close to an hour.
Oh yeah, that sounds good.
We can keep it really short. Kids, teens, young adults, if you want to watch the Olympics, hey, enjoy some high-level athletic competition. humans being able to do things you're surprised humans can truly do with their well-trained muscles and skills and talents. But don't go looking for morality. Don't go looking for any kind of way of life. If anything, the opening ceremonies show that there's just as much depravity in the planners of the Olympics that there is in, sadly, planners of most other things these days.